Good morning, folks, and welcome back. Someday I'll learn to turn off that alarm. It's Sunday again. We didn't have a stream last week. I was not feeling up for it. Do apologize. But we are back today, and we're talking gaming Ghibli. Now, if you follow the Discord at all, you'll know that this is something I've been writing on for the last week or so, posting quite a bit about my thoughts on gaming the sorts of things that you would have in a Studio Ghibli film, or films and anime series like those. Um, More specifically, the Miyazaki works, and I realized that when I'm talking Ghibli, I'm assuming that everybody's base position with Ghibli is through Miyazaki's work. Hayao Miyazaki's stuff is very specific and recognizable, but it is not the sum total of the stuff that Studio Ghibli has produced. And while some of that stuff, other stuff does work with what I'm going to talk about today, some of it is just out there and really doesn't. I mean, you could pull it in if you wanted to, but it's also not the sort of thing that people think of when they think of Studio Ghibli. Good morning, Cody. Good morning, Jason. Welcome. So, where does this come from? So, first of all, I've been a huge fan of Miyazaki's work ever since a random encounter with Totoro back in the late 80s. Um, my little brother had a friend, a Japanese friend that he had met at camp, who would come over and stay the night, for long weekends out at the farm, and he would bring his collection of undubbed, unsubbed anime, and then with his limited English, would try to describe what's going on to us, which was very fun. It was an early introduction to a lot of stuff that I didn't know was out there. Up until that point, I had been a huge mech head, Star Blazers, Shogun Warriors, Gundam, Macross, Robotech, Ixer One, Dunbine, things like that. I had known about the mecha stuff and the spacey stuff, but I had not seen this wide array of other anime that had been out there. And one among those were two movies, Laputa Castle in the Sky and My Neighbor Totoro, uh, which was really eye opening. And it would be a long time after that before I'd really figure out what was going on with those. Um, and of course, oh, and Nazca. He had also brought Nazca with him. So we managed to watch all three of those, and I had seen them. I mean, that's a good cross section, I think, of Miyazaki's work. In that, Totoro, you get the spiritual sort of comfortable mundanity, um, cozy cottage core kind of a thing, and then of course with Nausicaa, you have the blasted post-apocalyptic sort of adventure war story, and in between those is Laputa, where you have sort of this steampunk. Um, Similar story if you think about the major beats as Nausicaa. You've got a princess who holds a secret to solving the world's problems or stopping the bad guys. But the presentation in Laputa is sort of midway between. Anyways, so that is my initial experience with Ghibli and Miyazaki's work specifically. And so from there, though, that started a lifelong, I wouldn't call it obsession, but love of the work and the ability to recognize it when I saw it outside of Ghibli. There are several other anime that evoke the spirit of that. I'm not a huge anime fan, so there's probably a much wider list than what I know of. Um, but I mean, I'm a huge anime fan. I just don't have a lot of exposure to it, mainly just because of limited resources and the fact that I don't go chasing it down. Violet Evergarden um, is a great series that snuck up on me. I watched it on a whim. I was out of stuff that normally interested me. I watched it. It's um, very soft and deep, and at the same time has some real pathos to it. And so it definitely fits in there. Children of the Whales has a visual that is very Ghibli esque. and also has sort of that weird, mysterious world thing going on. Those are just two. I've seen some folks compare some of the later Zelda games to Ghibli in that they have that sort of comfortable nature versus adventure kind of a thing going on. But, anyways, this, of course, as a gamer, fed back into my gaming. It's a serious uh, problem, if you want to call it that, that I have as a gamer, in that anything that I am watching, experiencing, reading, coming in contact with casually makes it back into my gaming. Um, but with Ghibli stuff, it's always presented sort of a problem in that the style of play required to make Ghibli stuff feel like Ghibli is not conducive to a traditional, conventional sit down RPG type of a feel. There are RPGs that do it, and certainly it is a way of playing, but it's not one that you encounter frequently amongst D&D players, superhero players, sci-fi players, things like that. To play Ghibli, simply put, and have it feel like Ghibli and not just be a pastiche of the style, you have to be patient and you have to be willing to role play and just relax and make it through the story beats. Not make it through, but like play through the story beats. There can be action in Ghibli. There's not going to be as much as you would find in most tabletop games. It is definitely a role player's sort of a thing, because the most important thing in any Ghibli story is the interpersonal connections and the discoveries about self and the world that's out there. And the fights that happen, the conflicts that happen along the way are, in a lot of ways, very incidental um, to the main story. They motivate it and they move it along, but really it can be hard to translate that if you're just using the imagery of Ghibli. And one of the things that kind of got me on this role recently um, is a Kickstarter that's out right now for a product called Obojima. Now, Obojima is a Ghibli inspired campaign setting put into 5e. Now, not gonna. This is not about 5e, other than to say that I don't think that a Dungeons and Dragons edition of any sort is probably the best place to try to run a Ghibli world, because so much of the stories and the feel of those worlds revolves around interpersonal relationships, self-discovery, and character building, character growth. You need a set of rules that makes playing that worth it, that supports those key elements. D&D is not that system. You can play non-combat D&Ds. You can play social D&D games, but the system itself doesn't support them all that well, and it doesn't reward the play of those things as well as some other systems would. Now, flip this around. There are lots of games out there. Three come to mind: Ryotama, um, was it Golden Sky Stories, and then Whispering Wind is one. It's actually the one that I have. Let's see if I can pull this out here and show it off. Nope, I returned it to the shelf. Anyways, I should have had it available. There is also there, and there are several others, but um, they tend to pick a slice of what you might consider the Ghibli spectrum and then stick to that lane. Ryotama is about the journey, and it's in a fantasy setting, and it does a really good job of setting up a world where the play style makes sense, but it only does that. Golden Sky Stories Um, it has a very specific story beat in mind, and this is what a lot of them do. They pick a type of tale that they're going to tell, and that's what they do. It would be like sitting down and saying, "Okay, I'm going to play Ghibli, but I'm going to play Spirited Away, or I'm going to play Nausicaä, or I'm going to play Laputa." Um, and while that's not a bad thing, focused campaigns are definitely good. What I've always been trying to do is figure out a way and kind of really cook down Ghibli and find out what it is that's important, what the key beats are, and how I can meld them all into a big soup that has the distinct flavors of the ingredients that various styles and forms of Ghibli and Ghibli-esque media come up with, but allows a wider campaign world to be played in where you can play a number of different stories. In other words, I want to create a world where Totoro and Laputa coexist in the same world, where Ponyo and Kiki's Delivery Service coexist, where Mononoke and say, you know, whatever, Mononoke and House Moving Castle exist, and to do so, one has to separate the source media from what you're trying to build, and that's my opinion. A lot of times when you're conversing with folks about this kind of a project, um, you get tripped up on, well, this takes place in this kind of a medieval setting and this takes place in a post-apocalypse, and so we have to make sure that, and that's not what I would do or what I feel is the best way to do it. You want to create spaces where these story types can exist with not necessarily the specifics. Like a Nazca style story does not have to take place in a post apocalypse, and a Mononoke story can be set in a time frame that is not, gunpowder Japan. Um, and Laputa, for example, doesn't have to be in a steampunky world. I mean, I guess it kind of does because but the point is that it's to create a campaign world that allows for all of these things to exist and exist believably and cohesively. You need to pare back those specifics and kind of decide on a baseline and then expand and then write in your little corners of that. Real quick, just want to say good morning to RW Bishop and Mar Hockman. And Mar Hockman's comment here, um, absolutely. You want to evoke the feels and less about thinking. I don't agree with the second part on that. Because Ghibli stories are emotional, but they are also thought provoking. And they usually require their characters to figure things out. And that is, I think, also an important beat when you're trying to game in a Ghibli kind of a world. Um, you need mysteries, you need conflicts, you need turmoils that the characters go through. So, this is a good point to kind of talk about action. So, it is easy to think of tabletop RPGs as requiring combat. Even even very role play heavy games tend to dedicate a lot of time and space to combat. Um, and while combat does occur in Ghibli stories, and depending on the campaign world that you're setting up, it very much might have a war going on or a lot of fighting. There are other forms of action that occur regularly and other forms of, of conflict that occur regularly in Ghibli stories that are important to place in your world and can take the place of that combat. Obstacles, hazards, chases, these are all things that can sub in that action. Because one of the big complaints that I run into when talking to this with people is I wouldn't want to play a game where we just sat around and talked and got into the feels all the time. And that's fine. I mean, the right group would definitely lean into that and have fun with it, but not all groups are going to be created equal and not all players are going to want that. And so that is where things like the chases and stuff come in. Um, there are a lot of action packed sequences, even in very emotional and thought provoking Ghibli stories. Most of them have those beats. And if you're doing a campaign setting that is designed to live beyond a single adventure, because most of the movies really would be what we would consider in game terms a single adventure. You could repeat these over and over, and sometimes there might be more fighty stuff, and sometimes there might be more role play and social stuff. Sometimes there might be more hazards and environmental stuff. Uh, it just comes down to what stories you're telling. So we're back to then creating a world that allows for all of that. Um, my personal thoughts on that is that to create a setting that allows for all of that, you need to pick a level of technology that is high enough to be present, but low enough to not be pervasive and ever present. So we wouldn't want to do like a high tech futuristic world and try and run Ghibli unless it was so far in the future that that pastoralism had returned. Um, and then we're talking some serious like beyond Star Trek level sci-fi. Um, and then so like I would say then you want to make sure that whatever technology you're agreeing on allows for some of the more entertaining, fun things that Ghibli has technologically speaking. So I would say ideally in my head, like a steampunk or a diesel punk kind of a setting works best. Um, because in that tech base, you can have some crazy, wacky stuff. You can have airships. You can even have spaceships if you wanted to. You can have robots. You can have tanks and big old super tanks, and all of that stuff that we might think of in the expanded concept of Ghibli-esque universes. If you look at, for example, any of Miyazaki's notebooks, you'll see all sorts of crazy giant tanks that he's created and wacky aircraft and all of that. And um, those are worth bringing in, I think, if you're building a world. In fact, looking at his notes is what got me really thinking about how to expand this into a gameable campaign setting. In fact, funny enough, I mean, when I was creating my campaign world for my Miyazaki Ghibli style gaming, I just named the world Hayao after his name, Miyazaki's name. Because it's as good of I mean, it sounds kind of like Hyrule from Zelda, and it sounds like a planet name. So, and I said it with sort of a diesel punk Edwardian level of technology where it can flex to either side of that to create this very interesting technology where you might have uniforms that are maybe a little too Napoleonic, but the armaments are you know more World War One ish. Um, I think that's a good place to set your tech because it also allows then from when your tech is sort of in that indeterminate lowish high fantastic technology level, it still allows you to have wild spaces. um, and wild spaces are important to Ghibli, not deep dark wilderness spaces. Those certainly exist, but wild spaces that exist alongside the common folk in your campaign setting. If you look at any Ghibli movie, The towns are usually surrounded by open fields and nearby woodlands, or we're talking about houses set back in the farmlands. Very remote, rural, comfortable settings. Real quick here, yeah, one-offs in the same world is kind of how you would run it. But then again, that's sort of any campaign setting, whether it's Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms or Star Wars or Traveler or whatever, presents a world in which lots of things can happen, and then you play different campaigns in there of different lengths. Sometimes it's a one shot, sometimes it's a limited series sort of thing. 6 sessions and we'll be done. Sometimes it's an ongoing campaign, and that's what I'm trying to. Ultimately, that's what I would like to make if I was going to set up a Ghibli style universe to play in. Um, Now, when I was creating my world, I also was thinking about playing it as a miniatures game as well, and so the conflict also fits in there. So, technology level, wild places. I also feel like in the background of your setting, having some sort of a war or tense political situation or both is important. Hal's Moving Castle, Kiki's Delivery Service, Nazca, Lapita, um, Mononoke, uh, they all have something going on in the background which invades the foreground to different degrees. In Kiki's Delivery Service, we've got big airships, and we see. And then I know in like Howl's Moving Castle, we see all these engines of war, and whether or not it comes to the foreground is a different thing. Um, but having it there to use for your greater campaign setting is infinitely important. It's not going to feel Miyazaki without some kind of potential for war commentary. Um, the Violet Evergarden, another one that I had mentioned, has a war story in its background. The main protagonist, Violet herself, uh, is a weapon of war who is trying to find a new life outside of war. Um, and so, the war comes back to play within the scope of the series. Um, and that is, I think, something you want to have in your Ghibli setting. Some sort of conflict or conflicts, old, new, is important. Another thing that I think, actually, real quick before I go on, I want to RW Bishop, something like a multi-dimensional nexus. That way, different aspects could. I would avoid that. Honestly, I think that's first of all, I don't think it's necessary, um, and that only really needs to be there if you are trying to have your Ghibli stuff all separate. And I don't think it's necessary. Like if you're trying to keep the absolute spirit of the Miyazaki Ghibli properties unto themselves, then that's kind of something you would have to do, or you would have to have a world that is big enough to where parts of it exist in the realities as presented in those shows. Um, Jason from Mecha Studios and I were talking about this, and what we thought would be a great way to do it would be to have a wide world where, much like in Spirited Away or Totoro, somewhat slightly alluded to in Kiki's Delivery Service, um, that the spiritual magical world exists side by side with the real world. It's just that most people can't see it. And this is expressed in Spirited Away, and in Kiki's Delivery Service, Howl's Moving Castle to a degree, and Totoro. Um, we have characters who get pulled into this magical world or have the ability to access this magical world to a greater degree than the people around them. Um, and so, in doing so, you don't have to have a magical nexus. Now, if you have magic, you certainly have room for pulling in other dimensional things. Um, but I feel like that's sort of diluting things, but also at the same time, Ghibli is often not solidly defined. I would not say it's a hard magic system, for example. And so there is room for flex and play, and you could build and also build your world the way you want to build it. So, I mean, while the Nexus thing might work for you, I don't feel like it's necessarily the best way to handle the magical, spiritual thing in Ghibli. I think there's a more fun and entertaining and pure to the source material way of handling it, and that's the sort of spirit world existing alongside the spiritual magical world existing alongside the material world. And then I know Jason and I had even discussed you could give characters in such a setting a stat that the higher that stat was, the more connected to that world they were. This would be dependent stat for say magic using characters, but lower level characters on that might just simply, or lower stat characters on that might simply just be sensitive, and they might be able to know a ghost was in their house, but not really be able to communicate with it, or they could be able to communicate with it, or they could see it, all the way up to the higher levels being able to actually interact with and step into that magical world and then manipulate it to some extent or another. I'm going to take a real quick moment. Yeah, see, I think this is something that comes up a lot. Um, and I don't, I mean, so I'm not going to say you're wrong. I just don't feel that it's in keeping with the spirit of the overall Ghibli type setting. Um, Most of the Ghibli stuff comes up. It's all about exploring the world around us and interacting with the world that is there. Um, Setting into play different dimensions or different worlds. Um, I feel like at that point you're losing that connection to a single world that is core to that, to the emotion and the uh, the experience of Ghibli. Um, Traveling to an alien world and finding out that there are magical, mystical things there, it's just science fiction. Um, Finding out that your garden is full of little magical creatures at home is much different. Going out to pick an apple one day and finding a little girl on your tree branch, Ariete, um, is that it reinforces that coziness that I think is core to Ghibli. I'm not saying you can't do it or that it's not worth exploring. I just don't feel that, and this is me, I don't feel like that is the best way to explore it. Now, if you wanted to tuck parts of your world away in this same campaign setting, in the same world where you go to this forest or these mountains and there's something very different or magical about that, I think that could still work. And I think that would be a good way to handle that. Um, you definitely want to make sure that anytime you're creating or expanding your Ghibli setting, you're sort of doing this appraisal, this temperature check, in which you want to make sure that you're not breaking with what keeps Ghibli Ghibli. Um, and I know there's a term that they use, honobono, I think it is, and it's like, you know, comfortable, homey, but it also means dim or faint, which together those two meanings kind of describe Ghibli. It's sort of a low grade fantastical domesticity that can sometimes get kind of wild and crazy, but it all comes down to that comfy, what do they call it? What was the term that was used? Like like epic domesticity or something like that. I can't remember the term they used, but yeah, where essentially um, at the heart of it, all of those stories come back to a comfortable, homey place. Even Nazca, which is one of the big outliers on the edge of the Mononoke side, or the not the Ghibli stuff. Even Nazca, at the heart of it, is about this princess who lives in this quaint little valley and has this comfortable little life, who is then forced into bigger things to try and save that life. In Princess Mononoke, you have the rustic wild folk of the woods, and then you have this beacon of modernity, but in that fortress there's still a sense of home and community. um and the other and so you have that weird juxtaposition. Kiki goes to the city, but when she's in the city, what we're presented with is a city that, while yes, it has cars and all of that and stuff like that, is still a very quaint place. It's not a modern bustling city like we are presented with today. It's right outside that city is nothing but like trackless grassland. We don't see a sprawling suburb or anything like that. And um, so yeah, I mean, you can definitely tell it a lot of ways. Um, and by all means, tell your Ghibli stories your way. The next thing that I would think that wanted to say that I think is really important for a Ghibli type story is um, layers of history. I think that to create mysteries, to explore, having a world that's got some layers of time built into it, um, allows for that exploration and discovery. And this could be, Laputa, for example, has the overgrown, falling apart castle in the sky. Nazca has the world before the apocalypse. Um, and if you look at things like, you know, this is not a ton of examples of it, but I think it's important if you look at outside of Ghibli and into the Ghibli style things. It definitely helps. I mean, if you're going to use the Zelda reference, there is definitely room in there for sort of uh, layers of history and stuff and mystery. So, um, kind of hit on most of the points. I think that to really sum it up, it's and what's probably makes it the hardest to think about running um, is it is a heavily styled type of a setting, which means that the GM and the players all have to be invested in that style. Otherwise, it just ends up feeling like any other game. Um, it's also a setting that requires the GM and maybe the players, because you could do this collaboratively, to come up with a substantial amount of world before you start playing. I mentioned before my setting Hio. Um, so in that, I've got like four major governments that are in there. Well, it's technically three, with the fourth being sort of a offshoot of one of them. I also have a couple of non-human species in there. This is another way to add some playing options into the world that can work. So in my world, I've got these cute little fuzzy fox squirrel folk, and then I've got these weird little pig goblins. Um, and so they exist in the world. There are wild spaces that have spirit, and there are also the spirits in the story. But there's also a very serious like tension going on between these nations. There is a very heavily industrialized, brutal industrialism sort of a culture off to the north that is at always butting heads with this very sleek, high science, not high tech, but very pastorally advanced. And it was sort of, think of, and I've kind of in my mind sort of built them to be sort of French, Belgian kind of styled, where their kingdom is very lush and pastoral. They have the highest tech in the setting, but that's because they operate on scientific advancements. And I was inspired very much by like the late Victorian, early Edwardian periods and into the 20s and stuff, where it just things were getting invented, left and right. Like we were just coming up with all these scientists who were just really just coming up with new stuff all the time. And so that is them. And then there's this island nation that is, sort of Mediterranean, Italian in theme. Um, and then the fourth faction in the world is sort of this uh, scientific church that is attached to the one high science nation. But think of them sort of like the Vatican of science, and so they're sort of their own thing, even though they're technically out of this one culture. Anyways, that's the backdrop, and so we have this war between the North and the South on this, where we have the brutal industrialism of the North beating, butting heads with the advanced science of the South. You got these island guys over here, this, who sort of feed into that that war based on the fact that they're kind of reliant on both of them, but at the same time, both of them are reliant upon them. Off to the edges of this, there is a lot of wilderness. Intertwined with this is a weird kind of spiritualism, magical setting where the original people of this place, which are the little fox squirrel guys, they're more in touch with the world. The little pig goblin guys, they kind of came along with the folks in the north, and they're sort of like the exploited foot troops kind of guys for this human nation. So I've got all of that, and tucked in and away with all of that is just people doing people things. There are farmers, and there are shopkeepers, and there are teachers, and there are students, and there are witches, and there are scientists, and that juxtaposition between scientific advancement and progress and nature, that's also very key to Ghibli's work, the Ghibli stories and stories that are like them. So I mean, that's the cliff notes for my setting, but all of that then also has layers of history, and sort of a background, because the sort of subtext there is that the people, the humans that are there, aren't original to that place. They came from somewhere else. And so, they brought the little pig goblins with them, and the little squirrel, foxes, they were there. But then around there, it's been so long that kind of nobody knows what it was like before. Yeah, my cat is my constant partner down here in the basement now. And I'm on a major thoroughfare, so you're gonna hear a fire truck going by. Um, so yeah, she's always down here while I'm working and hanging out. So she just kicks back on her own chair. She got a better office chair than I do. I don't like the arms on the side of it. But anyways, so that did not take as long as I thought it would. And so I just kind of wanted to get my ideas for this out of the way, and then I was going to invite folks in for the latter part, and we can maybe turn this into a discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and throw into the chat the StreamYard link. And if you would like to come on and talk, by all means, jump in. You don't have to be on camera, you just have to have a mic. Because these are my thoughts and my ideas, and kind of where I would feel the comfortable spot would be, and what kind of adventures could you go on in a setting like this. I think anything you've seen in any of the media that I mentioned could fit into my world. Um, And that's, I think, the important thing. One of the problems I see with so many of these other settings or so many of these games that are made is they only do one kind of Ghibli story. And while that's fun as a diversion, you can only play that so many times before you're like, all right, we're doing this again. Mar Hockman's coming on. All right, cool. Welcome, sir. Welcome.
Hi. Oh, one sec.
Yeah. So, like I was saying, it's a matter of having enough in your world to tell multiple stories and to keep the campaign alive and breathing.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Oh, okay, cool. Welcome.
Sorry. It's one of those things where I realized that I had my external speakers still turned on.
Mm, well, I didn't hear it, so you're okay.
Really? Well, I mean, you had been. Well, anyway. I'm not actually someone who's a big fan of Studio Ghibli films. I've seen some of them and I'm like, oh, that's cool. It's fantasy anime. That's nice. I not really one of those people who ever really got why some people call them the best anime ever made or whatever. um, some of the tropes that they use though are things that I've seen that like you mentioned the whole like finding fairies living in your garden sort of plot device. I've seen that played with several different ways in several different fictional works. Like, do the fairies really like physically live in your garden, or do they just appear in your garden and use magic portals to sneak into your world from a different dimension? I don't know.
Well, and that's certainly something you can build into your game, and it's in a way it is something expressed in Ghibli stuff. Now, mind you, again, I'm not talking solely Ghibli. I'm talking about the Ghibli style, and a lot of the stories that Studio Ghibli has used are actual stories that exist outside of their. I mean, Howl's Moving Castle is a book. Kiki's Delivery Service is a book. Uh, Princess Mononoke is a book slash folktale. So they're not necessarily making up these stories. It's their iteration. And so yeah, I mean, fairies in the trees, fairies that slip into your garden through little portals, but that's you think that they live in your garden. It's not much different than, say in Totoro, where you have the soot spirits that are in your house, but they're extensions of the spirit world. Whether it's another dimension or it's the spirit world overlay, I think the net result is very similar.
Yeah, it's just well, that's kind of sort of what I was getting at with the whole like uh portals thing I mentioned earlier is that the worlds that you connect to with the portals aren't necessarily the human world. Circa 1982, uh, connecting to a steampunk world with elves and goblins. That it's not necessarily something that's like a completely or analogous place. It's a like a might be like a different like plane of existence completely that doesn't follow the same physical rules.
Yeah, I think that would work. I mean, so you could definitely build that into your Ghibli world. I would say if you're going to do that, then you're probably going to want to build it in as part of the core of how your world works. So going from the on-screen Ghibli worlds, there's definitely this concept that magic and the real world just kind of live overlaid on top of one another. Uh,
Oh, I, it's not a Ghibli thing. I just thought of something that plays with this concept in a way that's really, really strange, but noteworthy in how it's different.
all right.
Full Metal Alchemist. Do you remember what the plot twist at the end of the story is?
I've not watched the whole series, so I do not know what the
Well,
plot twist at the end
I'm
is.
not going to go into the like nuts and bolts of it,
No,
but the
no.
big
I mean, go
picture.
ahead. I mean, I wouldn't say. I mean, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't watched the Full Metal Alchemist. But go ahead. Let me know because I didn't watch it all the way through.
Explaining the details, I can't. Just
Well, not the details, just the plot
that
twist.
that would take like an hour. But the basic principle of it is that the energy in the world that the main characters live in, that is used to power magic, is actually being fueled by deaths in a different world. So, like, anytime someone dies in this other world, they their life essence is being subsumed into the world that the main characters live in, and that is the force that powers magic.
Yeah. It's funny, the Full Metal Alchemist, visually speaking and world building wise, I think you could easily fit something like that into a Ghibli style campaign anyways. So, and what you're talking about, whether you use it exactly as they present it in there or maybe fuse it with some of the standard Ghibli tropes, maybe magic, for example, in your Ghibli verse is is specifically and necessarily drawing off of the life force of spirits in the spirit world. So I mean you could easily, I mean, that kind of a basic mechanism definitely feeds in. You could of course have the multi-world thing because I think that having some of that in there is not without merit in a specific version of a world that you wanted to build. I mean, again, not everything is going to work in a campaign setting, and I think this has been pointed out by me in the Discord discussion, and also by a couple of folks here in chat stuff. Not every Ghibli thing fits together well. Studio Ghibli is a studio, and not everything was made by Miyazaki. And so, I think most people, when they're talking Studio Ghibli, they're thinking about Miyazaki's work. Um,
Yeah, and I don't personally think that all of Miyazaki's work was meant to be a cohesive.
oh, it's definitely not. It's not. But that said, neither are the inspirations that people use for Dungeons and Dragons, Vampire the Masquerade, Traveler, Rift, Gamma World, even Star Wars. So I think without them being designed to exist in the same world, there is enough tying them together to where you can create a world. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, why, how would you create a world that touches on these various things? Just like the guys who wrote D&D originally are like, hey, I like all these 80 bazillion books that all discuss fantasy and weird science, fiction, and I want them all to exist in one game setting. How do I do that? And then they went and did it. George Lucas is like, I like westerns, I like samurai flicks, I like classic mythology, I like Flash Gordon, I'm gonna make Star Wars. And that's sort of what I'm talking about here. I like Totoro, I like Nazca, I like Lapida Castle on the Sky, I like Kiki's Delivery Service, I like Ponyo, I like Ariete, I like all of this stuff. How do I make it come into one world? And while I'm at it, why don't I pull a little bit of Legend of Zelda in there? Why don't I pull in a little bit of Violet Evergarden, some Children of the Whales, some what I didn't even mention that I think would you can borrow from is Last Exile, which is a very 1920s, 30s future tech kind of a setting, but it still works. And so yeah, I mean, everything you're saying could absolutely be put into uh, a setting that you were building. And it looks like Mar Hockman may be having some
Yeah,
issues.
I'm back
Yeah,
now.
okay, cool. But yeah, I don't think that anything you're saying doesn't work. I'm saying that you can either use it whole cloth, like exactly as you're suggesting, or it's the sort of thing that you can use to inspire elements of your setting.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
as an old saying goes, there's more than one way to do it.
there's more to it, you mean?
There's more than one way to do it.
Well, yeah, and I'm not proposing that my way is the only way. I'm just trying to discuss
Yeah,
honestly ways
exactly.
to look at it that gets people thinking about it. And clearly you have. Like, if you were to do a Ghibli world, it would very much be different. Um, but as you said, you're really probably not going to be seeking to do a Ghibli style world because you're not particularly a fan of Ghibli's work. Um, and so that is also fine. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that, if you are trying to make a Ghibli game or a Ghibli setting, you're going to try and want to use as much of his stuff as you can. And I've seen through the games that I've read through. I've not played a lot of them, um, but I've read through them, read about their world building, and most of the games that are out there, like I mentioned earlier, they do one type of story really well. Ryotama is, like I mentioned, about the journey. You're going from point A to point B, and the game is about everything that happens between, and that's each of your campaigns or your adventures. Golden Sky Stories is more of a day in the life slice of life where you play uh, what is it, Henge or something like that. Basically, you're playing a little animal spirit people who exist alongside humans, and your whole job is to help people. And so that's that game. Um, the one that I have that I bought to play with my kids, it's called The Whispering Road, and it is very much a game of story beats. In fact, it even has in there, you start here, then you go through this, and you go kind of like thinking about the whole hero's journey bit where it has specific elements that the hero goes through along the way. Whispering Road is built that way. All of these attempt to tell a Ghibli Miyazaki style story at the tabletop to in varying degrees. Uh, the new one that's coming out, Obujima, which is the fifth edition campaign setting, the more I read about it, the more it really seems like just shoehorning Ghibli into fifth edition and giving it a bit of it's more of a Ghibli pastiche than an actual sort of attempt to tell the stories of it. Because at the end of the day, it's still playing like fifth edition. You're going out, you're killing monsters, you're getting treasure.
Well, as someone who is like a really, really deep fifth edition fan once pointed out to me, is that a GM who fully understands how to leverage fifth edition won't try to use all of the rules in every game, because fifth edition has rules for, like, okay, we're going to do a Sherlock Holmes investigation story today. You absolutely can do that with rules as written for fifth edition. You don't have to put combat encounters in at all.
No, but it's the game. But I will say this though: the game itself does not reward other types of activity as written as well as it does combat and exploration.
It's up to the GM to decide how much
I'm
XP
not
you
talking
get.
about up to the GM. I'm
I
talking
know.
about rules as written, and that's ultimately what it comes down to. Is a game tends to be played the way it's written.
Hmm.
A GM can always flex that. And early in my conversation with Jason, um, he had mentioned, I've run whole campaigns, whole sessions, without any combat. So have I. I've played
Hmm.
D&D games without a lot of combat. I've played very deep games. However, that comes down to me and the players wanting to do that. The game is doing nothing for that.
Well, see, that's one of those things that's interesting to me, though, is that if it's the players that want to do combat, having players who want to do combat, why would they be playing a setting that doesn't use combat?
Well, that's true. But if you're also having people who want to play a Ghibli game or a game that's all about interpersonal relationships and self-discovery and exploring things, why are they going to be playing? Why would they be playing a game that focuses so much on combat? And so this
Mhm.
is where the discussion turns to: why do we play games? Why do we play certain games? Games matter. The rules matter. because while we can do anything we want with any set of rules, ultimately we are picking rule systems. And if we really wanted to pull that apart, why play games at all? If we can just do whatever we want, why do we need rules and why do we need stuff? And why aren't we not just sitting around telling collaborative stories? Because we don't want to. We want to play games that have certain rules and we have that have certain guidelines and they have certain feels. It's just like you go to see, if you just want to see a movie, you can just park yourself in a seat anytime, regardless of what's playing, and just watch a movie if that's all you want to do. But if you want to see an action movie, you have to pick the time and the movie that you want to go to. If you want a romance movie, you have to pick the movie that you want to go to. Same thing with RPGs. If I want a game that is about the feels, I'm not going to play D&D. Even though I can get the feels out of D&D, the game itself is not doing me any good there. It's not doing anything for me in that. At the same time, if I'm playing a game if I want a game that's about the rolling of dice and about the randomness and about the not knowing and about the drama of, probability, I'm going to play D&D. I'm not going to play, say, a diceless game where it's all about collaborative storytelling. One of the reasons I don't play Powered by the Apocalypse games, for example, I've played 3 different times with 3 different GMs, Powered by the Apocalypse games. And the one thing that bugs me constantly as a player is I'm doing all the rolling. And some people love that player facing stuff, but I like that interchange of knowing that the DM or the GM, whatever you're going to call him, is rolling dice, and then I'm waiting for the outcome of that. And as a constant GM, looking at Powered by the Apocalypse games, I'm like, why is the GM even here? Why am I not playing a board game that just has a little card that says you encountered a goblin? If you roll a 1 to 2, you do this. If you roll a 3 to 4, you do this. 5 to 6, you do this. Because that's how
Well,
combat, for example, in Powered by the Apocalypse works.
I mean, I have seen people make the funny comment that some of these games are essentially just Mad Libs, the TTRPG, and should be embraced as such instead of a deep story world building game, which some people like that.
Yes, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but you're not going to play that game if what you're looking for is D&D. And that's my point.
Yeah,
So I would not be playing. Yes, I can make D&D work for just about anything I want to. I've done it. I've been playing D&D for 43 years, and I've done just about everything you could possibly imagine with D&D, from high politics to deep story to emotions, to lineage. I've done that, and it has carried me well.
I mean,
But
I personally played a Hyperborea game. Well, no, okay, not the entire campaign, but one session within a campaign where we ended up doing nothing but political negotiations.
that's not unusual. I mean, in a fantasy adventure game, a session like that is good. But again, where I think the big distinguishing factor is is a is that what do you want your game to do for you? Because again, if I'm just making whatever I want out of the game I'm playing, why am I picking a game? Yeah, and that's what it comes down to. I was recently looking at running Gamma World, and I have some modern OSR type, versions of Gamma World, and when I looked at those, I realized that while they would be perfectly serviceable in their iteration of basically BX as Mutant Future, in fact, that's the Mutant Future RPG that I'm talking about. The few things that it got away, it did away with, stopped it feeling like Gamma World. Like, it would definitely play the same technically, But at the end of the day, it's the little trappings that make it feel more like its own thing that I would be missing. And to not everybody's gonna have that's not gonna be important to everybody. But to me, it's like it's why I tend to avoid generic universal gaming systems, not specifically GURPS, but you know what I mean. Systems that are, there's a hero system, for example. D6 is a one that I've used because at the end of the day, a game that's built to do a thing is generally going to do it better than a game that can do all things. It's that whole master of the jack of all trades, master of none. And I'm gonna respond.
Or in the case of fifth edition, core game that doesn't do anything particularly well and has 100 supplements to add on detailed explanations for how to do each of those things better.
I would actually disagree. I think 5e has a really solid core. Unfortunately, the problem is that 5e from the very beginning has been at war with itself. It has a lot of stuff in it that it doesn't use or it doesn't use correctly. The core mechanics of 5e are a very solid version of D&D. It's updated and streamlined and works really well. The problem is that the rest of the game doesn't work. I was just talking to my wife this morning on our morning walk that um, fifth edition, for example, has made treasure meaningless. There's no point in gathering hordes of gold. It doesn't count for experience. It hasn't counted for experience for a while now in D&D. There's nothing to do with it in game because there's no requirement on the players to pay for anything. The only thing it can do for you is domain play by building a stronghold.
If your GM even bothers with domain play.
Or if the players want to. Let's not put it all in the DM. Very few 5th edition players are interested in having a castle and running a kingdom anymore. At the same time, it doesn't even make magical treasure worth having because characters in their own right are so powerful in 5e that the magic they get, which has now been downplayed from its original older edition versions, is kind of superfluous. Oh yay, I've got a +3 sword. Well, I've got a power in my character that allows me to get advantage on X number of attacks. So 5e at its core, the nuts and bolts of 5e, I think is a really good solid game. I don't feel where I feel it fails is how they built their classes, how they built their monsters, how they built the world around it. If you were to say to reverse engineer things like, and we're totally off the topic now, but oh well. If you were to put back training costs, put back in the things like having to actually deal with expenses and expendable objects, tracking equipment and weapon uses and stuff like that, and you were then to pull back on advantage. I like advantage as a mechanic. I think the problem with the advantage is that advantage was effectively a +5 bonus is what advantage does. So actually, I think it might even be as good as a +7, effectively, mathematically. But and then put the reliance back onto the magic items. You might have a decent. I mean, in other words, I guess what I'm coming down to say is D&D 5e as a core, with the rules being streamlined, could play better in an old school style, but you'd have to bring some of those elements back into it. And I'm not a hardline, old schooler. I mean, I think 5e as it stands has a place, and it's a fun game if you want a high-powered game. Anyways,
to thinking about you talking about treasures, I was thinking about the longest 5e campaign I've ever done, which was the one that I was playing with my siblings for several months. And one of the things that was notable about that is that I don't remember us ever spending any money.
No, you don't have to. 5e has no point in actually. One of the things that actually kind of got me on this tangent, I was watching. There's a YouTube video this morning that touched on this very thing, and I had watched it before my wife got up. and it really just illustrated really well. There's just nothing to spend gold on in 5e, and yet 5e games still throw the stuff out like it matters. Like,
Well,
okay,
actually,
we
that's an interesting point someone made to me once. Is that if the gold coins are literally useless in game, then it makes sense for them to be given away so freely because of the fact that they're literally just there to make the player feel like they've got loot when in reality they didn't actually get anything.
but they don't, and that's the thing. They failed to do that in 5e because they're pointless. Your players have no impetus, no reason to go ahead and get to, we killed that dragon. We got a room full of gold. Oh, well.
Yeah.
But whereas if you dial back, you're going to have the next session as all of those characters, all the players are trying to figure out how they're going to get that gold out of that dragon's lair because it's important. They've got training to pay for. They've got magical healing, and they've got lore, people they need to hire to get spells cast to do things. A party member died, so they have to pay somebody to resurrect him. All of these things that put a demand on the party and could be taken care of with gold are why you had that gold out there. Not to mention the older versions where it was part of your experience gain.
Mm-hmm.
But nowadays, really, unless your players are invested in it, which is always going to be an issue, but it's the only reason now in 5e for there to be those hordes of treasure is if your players want to actually do stuff with it. My particular party right now in 5e is wanting to do things with their money. But at the same time, I get the feeling that they're just finding things to do with their money. Like they don't really need to do anything with it. They don't feel like they have to do anything with it. One player is refurbishing an old keep that they had cleared out on one adventure, and the other player is reinvesting money into the family business, which is the inn back in the village.
Well,
But at the same time, I don't think they're doing that because it actually has any real merit in the game. I feel like they're just finding something to do with all the money they got.
well, I mean, merit in the game is you as the player having fun in the fictional world. So, I mean, personal benefit, it's fun, I guess. I don't know.
Well, and so here, yes, that is a thing. But I guess if you're talking, so are we talking now that we're talking about 5e, which was not the point of today's stream, but if you're going, and maybe this will be the last point I'll put on this, if you're going to be having treasure in your game, is the treasure in the game because it's part of the game, or is it just window dressing, and that's where it is in 5e? It doesn't
Yeah.
have it. It's not part of the game. It's not
Okay,
part of the
so
game anymore.
since we've gone like way off to talking about something that isn't even 5e, let's okay, so how would you do that in a Studio Ghibli setting? Handle treasure.
Treasure's not important in Ghibli Studio. So that's why I talk about like 5e or a D&D game is not the game to play a Ghibli story with, or not the best. You can do it. Like we said, you can do just about anything with D&D. But in a Ghibli type of game, you're talking about a game that is rewarding to the player. You're going to want to play this with players who really, if we're going to go back to like the four pillars, of D&D, there are going to be players who really like to lean into the exploration and role playing parts of the game of gaming, and feel rewarded by discovering things, finding things, learning things, and accomplishing things, and are not so much worried about the trinkets and the treasure that they accumulate all along the way. Funny enough, the old saying, and it was the friends we made along the way, is actually the treasure that you would have in a Ghibli type of a story. And it's going to take specific kinds of players to
And
appreciate that.
honestly, even in 5e games, making friends might actually be more important than treasure too.
Yes, but
Eh,
the thing is that in 5e, that's one thing that you can do. It's not. It's
the
not really
focus of
the
the game.
focus.
Yeah.
You know, there are all kinds of ice cream. I don't eat all kinds of ice cream, and more and different kinds of ice cream are more rewarding to me than others.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And so they, and I'm going to real quick, RW Bishop, yes, there are rules and tables on owning and running a business. I don't believe they're in the core products. They're in, I think Xanathar has a lot of stuff for downtime activities. Um, the problem with 5e, and this is where other third-party producers for 5e do it better, is that yes, they will give you rules for this, but it's usually some passing surface level thing, and a player who's really into that is not going to get a lot out of it. And that's kind of what I was saying about using D&D as a Ghibli storyteller as opposed to a D&D storyteller. It's not, the system doesn't reward players for doing the things that make a Ghibli story a Ghibli story. The role playing, the exploration, the interpersonal connections, that is not rewarded in gameplay. It's not detailed in gameplay. Yes, you have skills, but for the most part, it's like, okay, I rolled, I succeeded or I failed. It doesn't play into the game. The business is that running a business in 5th edition, for example, that you're talking about, a player that is going to really like that, who's going to really want to get into that, is going to have to go find a supplement written by somebody else to fully enjoy that in 5e, because 5e isn't going to give it to them. They've had some bits and pieces here, and the mechanics are there. You could probably put it together, but it's not going to be the same as, say, you know, an actual system and structure that generates, because I've seen people do this in D&D, and what they're looking for is, how much money did I make? What kind of fun am I going to have with this business? Because I've done it. I've played it. I've run it for players, and they're not just looking for a simple, like, well, I'm going to roll 1d4 times 100 per month of business, and that was my profit. Which is how a lot of the subsystems in 5e work. It's a simple roll. There might be a skill check involved, but your players who want to do that are really going to want something more. They're going to want something that is where the business itself generates some adventure. And I don't think that's an invalid point of view. I think your players, and if your players are wanting to kind of bring it back to Ghibli, if your players are wanting that Ghibli experience, they're gonna want to play through that experience. It's gonna be a lot of role playing, but where those skill checks come through and those story beats come through, if you're playing it as a game, you're gonna want some sort of system there for it. You don't need one, but then again, at that point we're just playing make believe. We're not playing a game. Yeah. So it's that weird thing of, like, at what point does your game stop being a game and just become
Collaborative storytelling.
collaborative storytelling? Exactly. I mean, at that point, if I really want the Ghibli experience, I could just write a story. If I could just write a story, enjoy my world, or I could do my own comic book or whatever if I have the art skills. And probably get just as much out of it, unless I'm somebody who just wants a collaborative storytelling game, and there are plenty of those out there. I'm not that guy. I mean, I do like role play. I do funny voices. I get into my characters, when I'm playing them, which is not very often, but when NPCs, I do a lot of NPCs. And when I build worlds that have verisimilitude in them. And even something as kooky and weird as a Ghibli style world, I think needs that that internal consistency, that verisimilitude, because there are rules in Ghibli worlds. They're not hard rules, but there's definitely an order to the galaxy, that exists within the context of those worlds, and you'd want to see expressed in a game. But yeah, it's it's no surprise to me, and this is full disclosure on the Ghibli thing, full transparency. It is not surprising to me that we have not really had in this country, native to this country, U.S. If you're not from the U.S., this is where most of the gaming market exists. um, we haven't had a successful take off, highly talked about, very popular game that does Ghibli. Two of them that I mentioned, at least, Golden Sky Stories and Ryutama, are actually imports from Japan where they were very popular and they were translated and imported and released for the US market. Those two games still, unless you know about them, you don't know about them. And it's not like D&D or Vampire the Masquerade where you might encounter them even if you don't play them or you're not a gamer. You're very likely going to run into somebody who you're very likely to have run into the conversation on those things, even if you're not a gamer. But we just don't have that for Ghibli. We don't have that for a lot of things, but Ghibli is it's like a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche. I mean, you're really just drilling down to a very specific type of storytelling. And the tighter you get that, of course, the less popular it's going to be. There are lots of people, despite it having been around forever, that don't know what Traveler is.
Well, I mean, this actually kind of sort of reminds me of a comment someone made to me about just how many different mangas you can find in Japan and just how many different genres those mangas actually have. And it occurs to me that this is kind of sort of like a derivative of that. Is that, it's like instead of writing a manga, you write a TTRPG.
Well, and there's a very different outlook and experience in Japan when it comes to manga and animation than there is in the US. They have discovered well before we did that it was a mainstream media and not just for kids.
Well, that's just it, though, is that in the US, it originally was done for the benefit of adults and got co-opted to being just for kids sometime in, I'm not sure exactly when. And then people
Well, actually, you really need to look at that though, because up until recently, there was really only one studio. I mean, Warner Brothers had its cartoons, but while they were made to be appreciated by adults, they were also made for kids.
well, they're made to be acceptable for children, not necessarily.
Well, and the thing is, Disney was the only people for the longest time doing, animated cinema.
I
In the
actually
mainstream.
kind of think that maybe possibly it was the rise of Disney and their family appropriate entertainment venue and using animation for that may have changed the cultural mindset on what animation was for. Because when you look at the original Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny cartoons, I mean, like the first 5 or 10 of them, I'm not sure that PG is a high enough rating. I'm really not.
But you also have to you can't apply modern sensibilities to them though.
Right, but
You have to look at what was acceptable for kids to see back then. It
but
was different than it is now.
that's the thing though, is that they weren't actually being aimed at kids because they were being shown as like a pre-roll at a movie theater where it was adults in the audience, not children.
Still though, I mean, the thing is though is that regardless of that, animation in America has been seen. Cartoons have always been considered for kids, even when there were cartoons that weren't just for kids. They were still considered childish. No matter how mature your comic book was, you were probably looked down upon for reading a comic book. By the mainstream, yes. It wasn't until the late 80s that animation started really being taken seriously as a vehicle for
But that's
for more mature storytelling.
that's like that. What's the best way to put this?
But
Okay,
the point I was trying to make, though, is that that was never really the case in Japan.
yeah, Japan never had that problem. That's for sure.
So while we may have started in the same place as Japan, we dipped down and then got back to it, whereas Japan just trucked along and expanded on that. They have, and because it was mainstream, it was so mainstream, it has evolved into 80 bazillion subgenres. Um, Whereas here, we kind of had to we're playing catch up. Nowadays you see a lot of comics and cartoons and stuff that are definitely not for kids, um you know and are very specifically for adults, even not just for that's a little bit more mature. It'd be probably better for older kids. There's some stuff that just flat
Well,
out just not for
I mean,
kids.
this is actually something that I realized as a small child reading the comic strips in the newspaper. Is that some of the comic strips? I mean, like Garfield, like adults like it, kids like it. Sure, cool. Then you have stuff like Sally Forth, which it's basically a soap opera in printed form.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. But if you look at what's on, say, the sum total of the funny pages, Sally Forth is a very small representation of what's on there. So, it's
20
there is
strips,
it
and there's like 5 of them that were actually adult.
yeah, but so it's not that there's never been mature cartoon
It's it's it,
content.
it's
It's
just that
never
they didn't
been
have general acceptance. Yeah, I get it.
it's never been it's also not really been mainstreamed for the longest time. Trust me, as somebody who has been a lifelong cartoon fan and animation fan, I've felt the slings and arrows of being that person. It's not, so clearly there, and it's not just like in my little group, like, being an anime fan in the 80s was a pain in the ass. Even worse so in the late 70s when it was first coming out, because you'd go to school and you know somebody catches you reading anime book or a manga or whatever, and they're like, what the heck is that? Not to mention, let's not even get into the misconception that everything anime was hentai or Transformers.
Yeah, that's another thing that gets weird is, and this is actually something that isn't just in the anime genre, but when I was a kid in the 80s, I literally once heard someone seriously tell me that uh, no one had a legitimate reason to own a VCR because the only times you needed to own a VCR is if you wanted to watch something that wasn't allowed to be broadcast on television.
Yeah, but every technological advance has
Well, but
had some sort of detractor. But
well, well,
also,
well, well,
also
well,
if you're talking about the 80s, it's not exactly the high point of
well,
of
the
American
point that I was
literature.
making though is that the existence of detractors does not really say a whole lot about the nature of the thing being detracted from.
No, it doesn't, but it does tell a lot about the nature of the community around it.
Yeah, I
And
guess.
that's my point. Because whether or not animation has been for kids or not is not the question. It's whether or not people consider it so. And
And like
that's the point.
and like R.W. Bishop points out, is that some of this might be the whole like art snob thing, uh, being treated as mainstream when it's really just a bunch of people who are full of themselves talking over everyone.
Well,
I'm,
and that's true because back in the 80s also, I my parents were very open-minded and kind of liberal, and so I was allowed to, even as a 9 or 10-year-old, pick up copies of Heavy Metal magazine and read it and enjoy it. And because most of that stuff is coming out of Europe, you can see there's a very different attitude towards what's acceptable in graphic media.
Also, heavy metal's name makes a lot more sense in the French version. Metal Hurlant.
Yes, I know, but there's no reason to get pedantic or pretentious here. You want to talk about art snob?
Well, the reason why I was getting at, though, is that the Metal Hurlant is a plot device within the thing to tie the stories together, as they're all things that the Metal Hurlant witnessed.
Yes. However, the title also makes perfect sense in the American context because everything in that magazine was very much what you would associate with the heavy metal scene in America in the 80s, because it was all about fantasy and science fiction and so I think while the translation didn't translate directly over, it was still a very solid point. And so yeah, I mean, yes, it had more meaning in France, but it's France, so everything over there
Yeah.
has it's
Anyway,
like
though.
France is the country that wants to tell me that a very basic sauce made out of cream and flour is something amazing and special. No, it's gravy.
Yeah.
So and I'm not here to bash on the French, but let's my point is that you can even see that difference in outlook on animation, between Japan or Europe and the United States, has very much colored how they approach it. It's not surprising that there are actually homespun anime-styled animations in France well before America is creating its own.
Well, I mean, like one that I saw in the early 2000s was, dang it, I'm trying to remember what the name of it was.
Amen.
Totally Spies.
Yeah.
Which is very anime-like, but it was actually made by the French people.
Yes, but way back before that, you had the was it the Ulysses series?
Yeah.
That was a French-made using Japanese animation studio, but it was made by the French. So, yeah, I mean, to be honest, almost all animation in the 80s was being made by a Japanese studio, because America just doesn't have this studio engines to do that.
Well, unless you're Disney, but that's the Disney style.
That's the Disney studio, and Disney's gonna do Disney.
Actually, so, that is also what Hanna-Barbera used to have a thing on. Is that's the like a certain era of like the 70s and 80s. It's like Ruby Spears and Hanna-Barbera. They were like the only people in the U.S. actually doing real animation work, and some of what they did was legitimately good. And then when those studios closed, that animation style disappeared.
Yeah, it's pretty much par for the course. And not to get too soapboxy, we're down to 3 viewers, so clearly this rant has has gotten. Anyways, there's a lot to be said for the U.S. letting go of things and industries over the decades. So, I mean, the fact that we also lost animation doesn't surprise me.
Oh yeah, it's like I actually watched the credits on certain of the more recent major animated works in the U.S. and realized that most of the names in the credits were Korean.
And that's because the studios are not in this country. You can have the creative teams and the developers and stuff will be here. And interestingly enough, even Studio Ghibli ran into this when they were making Princess Mononoke. Princess Mononoke almost tanked the studio. They were working so hard on that that was actually at the point where they had to surrender and decide that they were not going to keep it domestic, because that would have been always one of their points of pride, is that all of their work was kept domestic to Japan. They had to outsource to Korea to get that done, and they had to start adopting digital tools, which is they had always been traditional, hand drawn,
hand paint everything. But that's actually one of those things that.
But the cool thing is, in doing so, they developed enough. They developed their style and their technology enough to where when you watch something, say like Spirited Away, which is done completely digital, you don't feel it. Like when you look at Mononoke and then you look at Spirited Away, they don't Spirited Away doesn't lose a ton. If you're a super snob and you notice everything, you're gonna see the differences, but it's still the same style. To the point where Ghibli even went in and started digitally inserting line wiggle to make their digital animation look more like hand drawn animation, because it is that line wiggle that tricks our brain into feeling it's a little bit more believable and alive. They
Mhm.
actually have a term for it called like the spark of life or something like that in
Mhm.
animation. So when they were doing Mononoke, they started doing it just to make it match the stuff that they had already done hand celled. So they would start digitally inserting the line wiggle, and then they just kept doing it. And then you can really see where they lose their way when you look at their most recent offering, which is was it Ladybug or whatever. Like the one they did was, it was done in 3D animation, sort of
Uh,
like Pixar-y in a way. And while
well,
they tried to keep the same style of characters, it just doesn't feel the same.
one thing that I learned from watching documentaries about how old school animation worked when Hanna-Barbera and Ruby Spears were doing it, that specific style of animation. When you watch things like episodes of the Hercules, you can key in and looks like, oh, hey, that rock there, that's about to fall on his head, because the shade of color of the rock is slightly different
Oh yeah,
than the
because
wall.
it's not part of the background paint.
But here's the thing. Why is it a different shade? That's because the fact that the plastic material that they were painting on isn't perfectly clear, and thus layers of plastic would shade things, but due to how many layers of plastic are stacked. And
Yeah.
even though they painted the rock with the same shade of ink as the wall, it looks different because it's on a different layer.
Yeah, the other things that you get with that too, though, is that because it's going to have to move, it's usually more simply drawn and it doesn't blend into the painted backgrounds as well. Um,
One of the things that occurred to me, though, more recently about this, and it's something that I think that some of the more modern creators have probably exploited heavily, is that style of animation work would actually work incredibly well if you're putting it into Photoshop. Because you do Photoshop layers, you can layer the environment exactly the same way that they did with hand drawn cells. It's just that you don't have to worry about accidentally destroying a piece of plastic or having that color distortion effect happen.
well, I mean, there's a lot of things that differ between um, early American and Japanese animation as well. Um, One of the things, for example, if you bringing it back to Ghibli for a moment, one thing Ghibli does is that, so for example, in American animation, if a plane is moving at you, for example, the plane tends to move in the frame, right? But the frame itself doesn't really move. And something that Japanese animation has done for a long time, and then Ghibli is really famous for, is that the frame, the angle of the shot will also move around the plane as it's moving through the scene, which creates much more dynamism. And that goes all the way back to like Macross, because I remember reading about one of the things that was really different back then is that, so whereas American animation had a static jig for their photography, so you have your cell down here and you have your camera up here and you're taking your shot, right? In Japan, they had figured out a way to, and this got adapted in America eventually, but they would actually had their jig was movable as well. So while the action on the cam, so while on your camera on your cell, the fighter is maybe banking at the same time, the photography of that cell is also changing as well, so it creates even more movement and um, more dynamism in the shots, and also the animation itself. They would tend to not draw that fighter, for example, so just still in the middle of the scene. They would actually draw more of it angling and stuff, and so that's how you get those really crazy before the digital age, where it's kind of easier to do.
Mm-hmm.
You used to get those really crazy fight scenes where the mecha are flying all over the place around each other, or the magical girl and the bad guy are fighting, and they're just like these weird angles. And that's the other thing in animation in Japan. They don't just use the high end tricks for just the high end stuff like you would see in America. You know, nothing is magical girls and cutesy pokey fighters and all of that. They all tend to get the same treatment over there, as opposed to here where you're like, we're going to put a lot of money into it unless it's a big deal, you know.
Oh, that reminds me though, is that one of the tricks that Ruby Spears and Hanna-Barbera did that added genuine motion to shots was something that was so mind-numbingly mundane. You're like, wait, why didn't I think of that? And this is simply that when they would paint background scenery, they would paint something that was much larger than the actual frame that you would have for the video. So they could actually genuinely move the camera across the scene without moving the characters in the scene.
Yeah. One thing that I really do appreciate about Ghibli's style, mainly Miyazaki's style of filming and storytelling, is silence. And this is actually something that gets ruined a lot in the American presentations of his work, is that there are many scenes where the characters are just allowed to exist in absolute silence within a scene and just take in the world. And in the U.S. productions or U.S. dubs and stuff like that, and the even the big end, high end releases by Disney, they'll often work conversation in there that maybe doesn't exist or something, or music that didn't exist in the
Oh,
scene.
background music.
And so it ruins the shot. Not to mention some of the stuff that's been done has completely changed some of the meanings. Like if you look at the end of Kiki's Delivery Service, um, in the American version, she saves the day, she gets her powers back, she can fly, and she's able to talk to her cat again. In the original Japanese version, she saves the day, she can fly again, but at the end of the day, she looks down at her cat and tries to talk to him, and he just says meow. And so there's a bittersweet ending in that she's got her power back and she's grown, but she still lost a little bit of that innocence, that magic of her previous life, because she can't talk to her cat anymore. And it's a very different ending if you think about it. And it's such a subtle thing.
In terms of the emotional impact, yeah, that is a lot different.
Yeah, it is a very minor thing. And also just the putting music or dialogue in where there's supposed to be silence.
Well, that's actually
so many of his movies have just these brilliant landscapes where you're just supposed to exist in that landscape. I know, like in the original Nazca, that because I mentioned earlier in the stream, the first one I ever watched was undubbed, unsubbed, straight from Japan, brought in by my little brother's friend. And there are scenes in there where all you hear is just the wind of the desert, and that's it. There's no dialogue. You're just looking out, the characters existing, and all you're hearing is the wind. And you don't get that in the productions that are here. Anyways,
well, what I was going to say though is that one of the things that's the biggest annoyance to me when looking at pieces for their emotional impact, and what I came to realize in recent years is what made some of the really, really good anime different from American cartoons, is sound design. And that is that the way a scene feels is determined by the sound you hear. And some of the time there's just like some, like you said, theme song playing in the background for no obvious reason that just, why?
Yeah,
Or
or they'll sneak in dialogue or a voiceover or some that we've had.
I'm not even talking about like things where it's like changing. It's just like the original work being created in such a way that the audio in a scene is meaningless. It's like your thing of like looking at a valley is like you hear the wind, you hear the rustling of the leaves. You don't hear some orchestra playing in the background.
Yeah. And that's like, I know, for example, the guy, I can never remember the director's name. If we're gonna bring it back to real, like live action theater first, the guy who did The Witch, um, his movies often have just massive, very conspicuous fits of silence where maybe mundane things are going on in the background, but there's no music, there's barely any noise in it, and just the weight that lends to a scene. That's another thing, like for example, you'll see in Ghibli, like scenes of just mundane day-to-day life are often conducted, and they're not done to any fanfare or with any conversation. You'll see somebody go through the process of making lunch, for example, on screen, and all you'll hear is the tink of the dishes and the the spatter of whatever they're putting onto the pan. It it's a character that gets lost, I think, in a lot of and you have to make stuff for your audience, obviously, and let's face it, American viewers are probably a little bit more frenetic and a little bit more a short attention span than maybe a lot of Japanese audiences are. Though clearly audiences vary also in Japan, because you can see some very, for lack of a better term, spastic animation coming out of Japan where you're just like, what the hell did I just watch?
Yeah.
8,000 things just happened on the screen at once, and I still have no idea how it moved the plot along. But again, there's so much in anime. I think a lot of times when you're talking, even just the discussion of anime by American audiences is ultimately flawed, just based on how limited
Here's
our stuff is that we get over here.
here is a bit of trivia for you about the definition of the word anime. Toho Entertainment, a few months back, finished uploading the entirety of the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla series from, it was like the early 80s to YouTube. They categorized it as anime, even though it was made by Hanna-Barbera.
Yeah. Well,
because of the fact that to Japanese people, it's anything that's animated is anime.
Yes, but in common parlance, it's also a really easy way to distinguish Japanese animation from American animation. You're
Yeah,
also actually
but
right.
for Americans, not Japanese.
Well, yeah, for Americans, not Japanese. Just like there are plenty of Americans who would just call it animation. The only reason that it gets distinguished on, say, catalogs and stuff in the U.S. is because people are looking for it specifically. I mean, at the end of the day, a donut and a croissant and bread are all forms of bread, but they get distinguished when people are looking for them because of markets.
Well, I mean that's kind of sort of like, well, in Japan they actually have a lot of words for different categories of animated work. Like in the U.S. we have
There's
phrases like
shonen and shoujo and stuff like that. I know that
in,
they're
in,
very
in,
categorical.
in the U.S. though we actually have equivalents like murder mystery, cop drama, and soap opera. That's the same basic fundamental premise behind categorizing works of fiction.
Yes, and they have that in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And they and that's kind of how, in fact, that's how you find your types of animation. I mean, and I don't know them all, because of course it's not something that I'm super steeped in. I could probably ask my kids and find out more. But and when I was younger, I may have known even more. I mean, hell, let's just get down to it. The term for an anime fan has even changed over time. I mean, when I was a kid, the term weeb was not a thing. You were an otaku. if you were if you were a huge fan. Now, both those terms exist and they both mean different things slightly, but weeb is now more frequently used by a lot of by a lot of people, as opposed, and otaku is just kind of old hat. Like that's how you know some guy's a Gen X anime fan. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's gone way far afield, and I'm actually going to kind of bring it back here because we got about 15 minutes here. Just want to kind of touch bases on a couple of things. First of all, I missed a couple folks coming in. That was Cal and Daniel and Echo and Tonka Todd. Welcome, guys. Sorry I didn't catch you. Renfield, I also saw that you were Renfield. Haha. uh, but welcome all. And a few things here, like you mentioned this. The real actors didn't like to do voice work. That was you earlier. Let's see. I don't know about this. I feel like if you were to put it in a VR environment, I would still want it to be animated because otherwise it's not Ghibli. Because Ghibli's, even in Ghibli's weird form of realism, there's always a lot of expression and stylization in that realism. So presenting it realistically might not look Ghibli. Now, funny enough, is that so well known and so pervasive is the Ghibli style that lots of things in the real world are now being described commonly as Ghibli-esque. You know, you might say, I took a picture of this town in Spain. Isn't this just an absolutely Ghibli-esque scene? It's a real place. And it's probably the type of stuff that inspired Miyazaki, when he was drawing it. But so at the same time, when he draws it, it's going to be just a little bit more than that real city would be, just like any animation. Um, so I think if it was a VR environment, I would still want it animated as opposed to live action.
Oh, you wanted to talk about something that's like inspirational for like serious like making cool landscapes. Try looking up pictures of the Ganges Gorge and the Atlas Mountains. Those are things where you're like, oh, I've never seen places that look like that in person because there's only one in the world that actually looks like that.
Yeah, well, and more so what I'm talking about here though is people's interpretation of the Miyazaki Ghibli style. So like if we're talking, yeah, there's all sorts of amazing scenery that's very unique to its places. I mean the U.S. is full of them. And so there's but I think if you're this happens a lot when we see animation come to live action. It never feels right, perfectly right. And the times that it feels best is when the people making it have just decided it's not worth trying because they know that the animated image, the comic book image, does not translate to actual real lighting and real colors. Like if you take the same color base as of a comic, when you see this in the Marvel stuff and the DC stuff to varying degrees of success, the reason that they've changed those costumes so well is that the way that costumes look in a 4-color or modern color separated comic book page just looks like crap when you put it on a real person standing in natural or stage light. It just looks like shit. And it doesn't look real. It doesn't look believable. Sometimes it can't work. That's the other problem. There's just some costuming and some fabric selections and some color choices that just don't work in
I
real
actually
life.
used to follow several people very closely on Flickr who did a lot of cosplay stuff, and their commentary on how certain costumes work in practice versus how they look on paper is like, oh, okay, so like to actually make this work, you would more or less need to custom build a bodice that is hidden under the costume. Well, otherwise, it just won't stay there.
Yeah, either that or you're using a lot of adhesive, which is another thing that cosplayers do as well.
Well,
Um,
like one of the commentary was actually on a Mr. Sinister cosplay, making his cape stand out. They had to actually put a wire frame
oh yeah,
inside the cape to keep it uh, separated from his shoulders because it doesn't, float in midair
yeah.
naturally.
There are lots of things, and the same thing goes when you're talking about like very nicely painted scenes from an animation, like, or going back to Ghibli here, a lot of his scenes are very nicely painted. The colors are, you know, they're naturalistic. But if you were to take the same, if you were to take a photo of the same type of a setting, it's going to look different. And so going back to RW Bishop's thing about the VR, would you want it live action or animated? I guess it depends on what your ultimate goal is. If I'm wanting it to look like Ghibli, I'm not going to make it look a live action unless, and this is the other thing, unless somebody wants to start delving into that uncanny valley and goes in there and takes very real textures and then start shaping them in the ways that they are shaped and presented in Ghibli animation, at which point they're still going to look unnatural because that's just not how things grow. you know? And again, we're in that uncanny valley where like it looks like a real plant, but it's just something's off about it. But yeah, so we are at the last 10 minutes of the stream. I'm gonna go ahead and throw out real quick requests to the chat if you have any remaining questions that you wanted answered or thoughts that you had about gaming Ghibli, and or any of the game systems I mentioned, or the discussion that we've had here, sort of in the second hour. By all means, throw them out, and I'd be happy to go ahead and answer them if I can. Uh, but yeah, other than that, I'm pretty much said what I got to say, and this conversation has definitely gone far afield. Not that that's a bad thing. Um, thank you. All right. And my buddy Jason was supposed to come onto the stream, but he never actually did. He must have got busy with real life. Go figure.
Yeah, it's just like I had this feeling like you were expecting someone to show up all along. It's just like,
Oh
huh.
no, no, no. My plan was to actually get my initial thoughts out of the way and then invite somebody on. So exactly as I presented it, because I find that having an open forum and discussion a lot the entire way can often really stop from getting the main point across. The GI Joe stream on the was a different matter because that was me and then two very knowledgeable GI Joe panelists, for lack of a better term, who were here to talk about the main topic from the get go. But I wanted to express my thoughts and my ideas first, and then bring somebody in to talk. And um, Jason was going to come in, but I also know that he's got a very busy home life, and so as such, your time is not always your own. So no shade there. Let's see. I will say final thoughts on this. I mean, honestly, everything I've said today is how I would approach it and my thoughts on the subject. There is one final consideration that has to be said anytime you are delving in down that rabbit hole of creating a gaming experience out of something you enjoy. And that's that there's always the very real possibility that it just straight up is not gameable, or it's not worth it to try to game it. And not worth it as in like it doesn't have value or merit. It's just the level of effort, the cost to achieve it is either unattainable or too difficult. Ghibli, for example, even if I can create a world that's going to be broadly accessible and wide open to all kinds of stories, I may never be able to find players. Even if you can find players for it, are they going to be the sorts of people who are into it enough to really make it still feel like that? And we've all seen this with other games based on other IP and other styles. You set out to play those games, but ultimately, once you start playing them, they just feel like any other gaming experience. This happens with Star Wars, for example. A lot of Star Wars games just end up being Firefly with lightsabers because folks don't necessarily want to play Rebels. They don't necessarily want to, they just want to go do spacey stuff in the Star Wars
That,
universe.
that is actually something that's I saw someone making an interesting point about, though, is that um it was a discussion of the difference between Star Wars and Star Trek. And Star Trek is a very broad universe. You have hundreds of alien races who, well, okay, only a few dozen of them are actually major players in the story, but they all exist. In Star Wars, there's like humans who are the main driving force behind most events in the galaxy, and most of the aliens are just there to look decorative.
Yeah, but at the same time,
And,
I've played Star Trek RPGs many times, and without people wanting to play Star Trek, who are willing to play Star Trek like Star Trek, it does just degenerate into any old other game. Um, yeah, I remember, um, and he may reach out to me afterwards, but one of my players was playing the chief engineer, and his background was from sort of one of those hellish worlds that we always hear about in Star Trek. The kind of degenerate worlds that people often get brought up in, kind of like Tasha Yar and stuff like that.
yeah, like the border colony worlds that,
Yeah, but anyways, his character was playing one of those,
unlike
and
the
so they're
core
getting ready for an
Federation
away
world.
team. They're getting ready for an away team, and he shows up just blistering with weapons and body armor and stuff like that. And I had to stop, and I'm like, I get that your character has this survival instinct, but I really don't feel like that's something that anybody on a Federation ship would do or be able to do. I could see if maybe he had a personal, phaser or a knife or something tucked into his boot. Or maybe on his belt, he had a little bit more, he had one little pouch with some extra equipment or something tucked into his uniform or something like that. He is the chief engineer, but showing up in like full Federation body armor, which we know they have the security armor and stuff like that, and carrying a phaser rifle and and all of this stuff. I I'm like, first of all, you're the chief engineer. You're not the security guy. But again, my point being is when your players, it's up to your players to play in the settings. So any game comes down to, do your players actually want to play that world, or they just want to play in that world? um, because Star Wars turns into Firefly real easy. Um, any superhero game can easily just turn into the Mystery Men or the Watchmen, despite whatever style of superheroes you're wanting to play. Um, you know, you mentioned Star Trek. At the same time, Star Trek only feels like Star Trek if at least from the Federation perspective, if all of that pomp and circumstance and that veneer of propriety is maintained with your Federation. If your Federation if players start acting like a bunch of hooligans, you're not playing Star Trek anymore.
Yeah. That does. Well, it's
FOSSA got
actually,
that. FOSSA got that back in the day when FOSSA had the rights for the Star Trek game, because they made Merchants and Privateers, which was a great supplement that allowed you to basically just tool around the Star Trek galaxy in your own independent merchant or trade ship, because they
well,
knew people would want to do that. So, but you can't really do that on a Federation ship.
that was actually one of those things that came up in that discussion, though, is that Star Trek feels like Star Trek because everything is told from a Federation perspective. So, yeah, the lens filter of Federation officers doing Federation officer things for Federation officer reasons, and thus, if you're playing as a Federation officer, it's just expected for you to fit into that mold.
Yeah.
But if you're, in Star Wars playing as Rebel Scum, trashing planets in the hope that you will overthrow the evil empire, you know.
There's still some concession there. That will be a conversation for another day, though, because we are at the end of the stream. Thank you, Mar Hockman, for coming on. And thank you, everybody who came into the stream today or to the comments today and asked questions. This was very much a niche discussion, and I get that. It's not a subject that everybody is all that interested in, and which has always been my problem in trying to get it gamed. I've never actually been able to play in a Ghibli style world.
I was really hoping there'd be more than just me talking. Oh well.
You don't I put the link out there. It's open to anybody, and when I put it into the comments, I'm very much, just for future reference, folks, I'm very much putting it out there because anybody can come on and talk. But at this point, I'm gonna have to say goodbye and have a great rest of your Sunday. Everybody who came on who has shows, that was GM Cody, that is Mechhead Studios. Those are the only two that I know who have regular channels. I know, Mar Hockman, you've been posting some stuff.
Yeah, well, so some of that discussion I was talking about with the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars was because I made that video discussing the various weird plot devices used in the first series of TNG.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, he's got some very thought-provoking videos, so definitely go ahead and check him out. I don't. Your channel, I'm not sure what the name of the channel is.
Mar Hockman.
Is it just Mar Hockman? Yeah, I know you post in some of on my Discord your episodes. So if you go over to the Elfbait Discord, the most recent post in the video announcements is one of his videos, and it's the video he's just talking about there. And so that'll take you to his channel. But I am gonna say, have a great Sunday. Get out and game and have a good one.
You too.